In a forgotten orphanage, a boy clung to a single battered photo, believing that somewhere, goodness still lived. When Keanu Reeves walked through that broken doorway, he had no idea his quiet kindness would change a life forever. Stay until the end. This incredible story will leave you breathless. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The rain had just stopped when Keanu Reeves stepped out of the dusty van, his boots landing on uneven gravel. He wasn't supposed to be here. The day's charity shoot had wrapped hours ago at a nearby school, but when one of the volunteers mentioned a struggling orphanage just down the road, Keanu asked if they could take a detour. No cameras followed, no handlers announced his arrival. Just Keanu, walking quietly toward a rusted iron gate. The building beyond was crumbling, paint peeling from tired walls, windows patched with plastic sheets. But through the brokenness, the sounds of children laughing drifted faintly across the courtyard. It was the kind of laughter that carried both hope and heartbreak, stitched together by necessity. As Keanu entered the courtyard, the children scattered like startled birds, their small faces peeking out from doorways and cracked windows. Some clutched handmade toys. Others simply stared, wide-eyed, unsure if this stranger was real. He smiled gently and crouched down to tie a loose shoelace, giving them time to adjust. Slowly, a few brave ones inched closer, curiosity outweighing fear. And that's when he saw him. Standing a little apart from the others was a boy, maybe 17, thin as a rail, his clothes carefully mended but worn thin. In his hands, he clutched something awkwardly close to his chest, a faded, tattered photograph. The image was unmistakable. It was Keanu himself. Younger, frozen in time as Neo from The Matrix, eyes fierce and full of fight. The boy's grip on the photo was so tight his knuckles had turned white. Keanu felt something shift inside him, a pull deeper than compassion. It was recognition, the kind of silent, wordless connection that needed no introduction. He could have kept the visit short. A few smiles, a few polite handshakes, maybe a donation left behind before slipping away unnoticed. But something in the way the boy stood, rooted to the spot, heart in his hands, made Keanu stop moving altogether. The boy didn't approach, he didn't call out. He simply stared, willing himself not to hope too much. Keanu made the decision without even thinking. He wasn't going to leave. Not yet. He took a slow step forward, his hands loose by his sides, keeping his movements soft so he wouldn't spook the boy or the others, still hovering by the doorways. The boy's eyes widened. He glanced down at the photo, then back up at Keanu, as if checking to see if the man in the picture had somehow stepped into the real world. Keanu smiled warmly, a smile that said, "It's okay. You're safe." The boy took a shaky breath and stayed where he was, the photo crinkling slightly in his trembling hands. Keanu knew then, this wasn't just about a movie. It wasn't about fame. It was about survival. Somewhere along the line, this boy had found something in that image to hold on to when the world had offered nothing else. And Keanu wasn't going to be just another person who passed him by. Keanu moved closer until he was standing just a few feet away from the boy. He dropped into a crouch, bringing himself down to eye level without rushing or crowding. The boy shifted his weight nervously, still clutching the photograph to his chest like a shield. Softly, Keanu spoke. "That's a good picture," he said, with a gentle nod toward the photo. "Did you like the movie?" The boy gave a small, uncertain nod. His eyes darted sideways, as if checking to see if anyone would scold him for talking. When no one did, he looked back at Keanu with a mix of awe and disbelief. Keanu could tell he wasn't used to being asked questions, probably not used to anyone really listening. He sat down on the cracked concrete beside him, not minding the dirt or the dampness seeping through his jeans. Around them, the other children whispered to each other, peeking out from behind pillars and door frames. But Keanu kept his focus steady. "My name's Keanu," he said, offering his hand. For a long second, The boy just stared at it. Then, hesitantly, he slipped his thin fingers into Keanu's palm. His grip was light, almost afraid, but it was there. "And you are?" Keanu prompted softly. The boy's voice was barely a whisper. "Mateo," he said. Keanu repeated it with a smile, like it was the most important name he had ever heard. "Nice to meet you, Mateo." The boy ducked his head, a hint of a shy smile flickering across his face. For the next few minutes, they just sat there. No cameras, no scripts, no handlers ushering Keanu to his next appointment. Just a famous man and a forgotten boy, sharing the same patch of cracked earth. Keanu noticed how Mateo kept sneaking glances at the photograph, how his fingers would trace the edges of it, smoothing out creases that had long since set in. It wasn't just a memento, it was a lifeline. Keanu understood that in a way few others could. He asked simple things: what Mateo liked to do, what dreams he had when he closed his eyes at night. Mateo answered slowly, haltingly, as if unwrapping a part of himself he had kept hidden for too long. He talked about how he found the photo years ago, folded inside a magazine left on a bus stop bench, how he had no idea who the man was at first, but something about the face made him keep it, made him believe, deep down, that maybe people like that really existed, strong, brave, and kind. Maybe the world wasn't all bad after all. Keanu swallowed the lump rising in his throat. He had come here expecting to offer comfort. Instead, he found himself receiving something far more sacred: the simple, staggering faith of a boy who had every reason to give up, but hadn't. The orphanage director, an older woman with kind but exhausted eyes, watched from a distance. She didn't interrupt. She just pressed a hand over her heart, recognizing the rare moment blooming on that cracked sidewalk. Keanu stayed sitting with Mateo as the afternoon light began to fade. A few other children gathered closer, emboldened by the sight of him staying so long. One girl, no more than 8, handed Keanu a wilted daisy she had plucked from the edge of the playground. He accepted it with a bow, making her giggle and hide her face behind her hands. But it was Mateo who held his attention. Keanu asked if he liked movies, and Mateo nodded shyly. He confessed that he had only seen a handful, ones shown at the orphanage during holidays. His favorite wasn't even a blockbuster. It was an old tape about a lost boy who found a new family. It wasn't the explosions or the special effects that stayed with him. It was the idea that someone could be found, that no matter how invisible you felt, somewhere out there, someone might be searching for you too. Keanu's throat tightened painfully. He glanced at the battered photo again, so worn it looked like it might fall apart at the slightest touch. It wasn't just a fan's memento. It was a beacon, a silent prayer. When the director finally approached, apologizing for the poor condition of the orphanage, Keanu waved it off gently. He wasn't there to judge. He could see with his own eyes that love still existed here, even in broken hallways and crumbling walls. Before he left, Keanu asked Mateo if he would like a picture together. The boy's eyes widened with disbelief. He clutched the old photo tighter for a moment, then slowly, almost reverently, nodded. One of the caretakers snapped a picture. Keanu crouched beside Mateo, both of them smiling, though Mateo's was shaky, like he couldn't quite believe it was real. Afterward, Keanu leaned down and spoke, just for him. "You've already survived more than most people ever will," he said quietly. "You're strong, and you matter." Mateo's eyes filled with tears he tried so hard to blink away. Keanu squeezed his shoulder, not rushing the boy's emotion, letting him hold on to the moment for as long as he needed. And then, before leaving, Keanu made a silent promise to himself. This boy would not be forgotten, not while he still had breath to make a difference. As Keanu walked toward the car waiting to take him back to the city, he looked back once. Mateo still stood there, small and unsteady, clutching the 2 photos to his chest, the old dream and the new memory. Both, now, impossibly real. Keanu approached slowly, careful not to overwhelm the boy. His steps were unhurried, his hands relaxed at his sides, every movement saying, "It's okay, you're safe." When he reached him, Keanu crouched down so they were eye level. "Hi," Keanu said simply, his voice soft. The boy blinked, startled, clutching the battered photo tighter to his chest. He nodded but said nothing, his mouth opening and closing like he couldn't quite find the words. His cheeks flushed deep red, and his eyes dropped to the ground. Keanu smiled warmly, not pushing. "My name's Keanu," he said. "What's yours?" The boy swallowed hard, then answered in a whisper so quiet Keanu had to lean in to catch it. "Mateo." "Mateo," Keanu repeated, as if it was the most important name he had ever heard. The boy risked a glance upward, his wide eyes searching Keanu's face, as if still uncertain that this moment was real. When he saw only patience there, Mateo's shoulders relaxed slightly, though his fingers still twisted the edge of the photograph nervously. For a moment, neither spoke. Around them, the sounds of the orphanage faded. The laughter, the clatter of dishes, the call of a teacher gathering younger children. It was just the two of them, suspended in a pocket of quiet understanding. Keanu nodded toward the worn photo. "Is that me?" he asked gently, as if he didn't already know. Mateo gave a tiny nod. Keanu smiled again, not the kind meant for cameras or interviews, but a real small smile that reached his eyes. "It's seen a lot of life, hasn't it?" The boy finally found his voice. "I found it," Mateo said, his words halting. "A long time ago, in a magazine, in the trash behind the market." Keanu listened, not interrupting. I didn't have much," Mateo continued, his eyes fixed somewhere over Keanu's shoulder. "But when I saw it, I thought maybe, if someone like you could be real, maybe good people were real too." His voice broke at the edges of the sentence, and he looked down again, ashamed of the emotion spilling over. Keanu's chest tightened. He recognized that kind of hope, the kind you cling to when the world feels too dark to navigate alone, the kind that keeps you breathing when everything else says stop. "You were right," Keanu said quietly after a moment. "Good people are real, and so are strong people, like you." Mateo shook his head fiercely, but Keanu didn't let him retreat into silence. He stayed crouched there, grounded and steady, giving the boy space to believe it for himself. "You're stronger than you know," Keanu added. "You're here, that means something." The boy's hands trembled as he clutched the photo tighter, like it was the last thing keeping him tethered to hope. His lip wobbled, but he bit it hard, refusing to cry. Keanu didn't point it out. He didn't offer empty comfort. He just stayed. And sometimes, that's the greatest gift anyone can give. The minutes passed without pressure. Mateo began to breathe easier, the rigid set of his shoulders slowly loosening. Keanu shifted to sit cross-legged on the ground, inviting a softer space between them. A few children peeked from the doorway, curious but respectful, sensing something sacred unfolding. Finally, Mateo spoke again. "I used to think," he said, voice shaking, "that maybe you were like a guardian, like someone who was supposed to find me." Keanu didn't laugh. He didn't brush it off as childish fantasy. Instead, he leaned in, elbows resting lightly on his knees. "Maybe," he said, voice even softer. "Maybe we're all finding each other in ways we don't even understand." Mateo's eyes filled with tears he couldn't hide this time. He wiped them away angrily with the sleeve of his shirt, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Keanu shook his head gently. "Don't be. Tears are just love you can't hold in." Mateo stared at him, caught between disbelief and the desperate need to believe. No one had ever said words like that to him. No one had ever looked at him without pity or impatience. Only this man, this stranger, who somehow made him feel less alone. From his back pocket, Keanu pulled out a small, folded notebook and a battered pen. He always carried them, a habit from years of writing down stray thoughts, small ideas, moments he didn't want to lose. He tore out a blank page and held it toward Mateo. "Here," he said. "Write down anything you want to remember from today, anything that matters." Mateo took the page with reverence, smoothing it carefully on his knee. At first, the pen hovered uselessly over the paper. Then, slowly, his hand began to move. A few words, a sentence, a line of something that might one day become a dream. Keanu didn't watch him write. He simply sat quietly, giving the boy the dignity of his own moment. After a while, Mateo looked up. "Why are you here?" he asked, the question trembling in the air. Keanu thought about it, about the schedules, the interviews, the polished press events that filled so many days. Then he looked around. The peeling walls, the cracked floor tiles, the children's laughter rising despite everything, and smiled. "Maybe to remind myself what matters," he said. Mateo clutched the paper in one hand, the photo in the other. Two fragile artifacts of hope. Keanu stood slowly, stretching out his legs. "You mind if I come back tomorrow?" he asked, casual, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Mateo's mouth fell open slightly. He nodded quickly, almost afraid to speak in case it shattered the moment. Keanu winked. "Good. Then it's a plan." As he turned to leave, he caught sight of the orphanage director watching from the far end of the courtyard, hand over her mouth, tears tracking down her weathered face. Keanu simply nodded to her too, no words, no grand speeches. Sometimes, the smallest moments rippled the farthest. And somewhere deep inside, Mateo's heart began to believe maybe he wasn't forgotten after all. The next morning, Mateo was already waiting by the gate before the sun had fully risen. He had barely slept, afraid the promise might fade like so many others had before. But as the first rays of light stretched over the cracked courtyard, there he was, clutching his folded page, the photo safely tucked in his jacket. And then, just as promised, Keanu arrived. No entourage, no cameras, just a quiet smile and a small brown bag that smelled faintly of fresh bread. "Breakfast?" Keanu offered, holding the bag out like a secret. Mateo hesitated, then nodded. They sat again on the same worn steps as the day before, splitting the bread between them like old friends sharing something more sacred than a meal. This time, Mateo talked more. About the early years he barely remembered. About the older boys who came and went from the orphanage, some running toward dreams, others running away from pain. About the nights he lay awake, staring at the stars through a cracked window, wondering if anyone out there ever thought of kids like him. Keanu listened. No advice, no quick answers, just steady presence. At one point, Mateo pulled out the folded paper from his pocket and showed Keanu what he had written the day before. At the top, in shaky but determined letters, were the words, "I am not invisible." Keanu stared at the paper for a long moment. Then he nodded solemnly. "That's right," he said, "and you never were." Mateo's throat tightened. He looked down quickly, blinking hard against the tears that threatened again. "You know," Keanu added, "sometimes the world forgets, it gets busy, it looks away. But that doesn't mean you stop mattering." Mateo looked up, searching Keanu's face for any sign that he was just being kind. But all he saw was truth. Quiet, unshakable truth. The other children were starting to stir now, their laughter trickling out of the dormitories. Somewhere a caretaker called for breakfast, her voice cracking the morning air. Keanu rose, brushing crumbs from his jeans. "I'll be around," he said casually, as if he wasn't altering the course of a boy's life with every passing second. Mateo stood too, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if this stranger who had become his anchor would stay or drift away like so many others. But for the first time in a very long time, he felt something solid beneath his feet. Hope. Real. Tangible. His. As Keanu disappeared into the courtyard shadows, Mateo pressed the photo to his chest and whispered a promise to himself. I will be someone worth remembering too. And somehow, he knew he already was. Later that evening, after leaving the orphanage, Keanu found himself sitting alone in a small, dimly lit hotel room. The window overlooked a battered stretch of street where the occasional motorbike buzzed past, kicking up dust and forgotten dreams. He leaned back in the creaky chair by the desk, pulled out his laptop, and opened the Foundation's private forum. It was a place meant for sharing quiet reflections, for building small bridges between strangers who had no one else to listen. Without adding his name, Keanu began typing. Has someone you admired from afar ever given you hope? The words blinked back at him, small but powerful. He thought of Mateo's wide, cautious eyes, the way he held that old photo like it was a lifeline, the way a single picture had kept a boy believing that somewhere, somehow, kindness still existed in the world. Keanu continued, his fingers moving steadily over the keys. Sometimes we are saved not by grand gestures or famous people we know, but by the simple belief that good still lives somewhere out there. Sometimes hope wears the face of someone we've never even met. He hesitated, then hit post. Almost immediately, the comment section began to fill. One story came from a woman in Oklahoma who wrote about her high school art teacher, how the woman's quiet encouragement had kept her from dropping out when life at home became unbearable. Another came from a veteran in Arizona who remembered a chaplain during his third deployment overseas, a man who would sit beside him, not preaching, not lecturing, just handing him a bottle of water and listening when the nights got too heavy. Story after story appeared like lights blinking on across a dark map. A single mother from Boston shared that as a teenager, she had carried a battered poster of an Olympic athlete on her wall, drawing strength from the idea that someone, somewhere, knew how to keep fighting through pain. A retired nurse from Detroit wrote about how, during her lowest days working endless shifts in an ICU, she survived because she believed in the goodness of a stranger who once paid her coffee without a word, just a knowing smile. Hope, it seemed, didn't need a stage. It didn't need fanfare. It just needed to exist. Scrolling further, Keanu paused at one particular reply. It was short, simple, but it hit like a stone dropped into a still lake. Sometimes it's not the people we meet that save us, the comment read. It's the ones we believe exist. He stared at the words for a long time, feeling something deep inside his chest stir. It wasn't about being a hero. It wasn't about fame or headlines or gestures big enough to fill a screen. It was about being real, being kind, being there, even if there meant existing quietly in someone's imagination, long enough to keep them moving forward. Keanu closed his laptop gently, the screen fading to black. In the silence that followed, he thought of Mateo's trembling smile, the way the boy had clutched the photo like a prayer answered after too many nights spent alone. He whispered a promise into the empty room. I'll keep showing up, even if no one ever knew, even if the only proof was a battered photograph held in the heart of a boy who believed in better days. Especially then. The next morning, the forum's responses had multiplied. Keanu sat with a cup of black coffee cooling at his side, scrolling through the flood of memories, heartbreaks, and quiet triumphs posted overnight. There were no arguments, no debates, only pure connection. One young man wrote about growing up in the foster care system, abandoned more times than he could count. He said he survived because of a single sentence a firefighter said to him after pulling him from a burning house. You're not trash, you're important. The man said he held on to that one moment of human dignity until he could build a life of his own. A woman from a small town in West Virginia shared how, at age 16, she saw a public speech by a woman who had survived unimaginable tragedy. She didn't remember the speaker's name, but she remembered the way she stood, head high, voice steady, and it convinced her, quietly but irrevocably, not to give up on her own life that night. Another post came from a middle-aged man who had battled addiction for years. He wrote about how a security guard at a rehab center had once sat with him for an hour after everyone else had given up. The guard said, "You don't have to be perfect tomorrow, just show up." That conversation saved his life. Keanu read every story slowly, letting each one settle deep in his bones. It struck him how so often the people mentioned didn't even know they had changed a life. And it wasn't because they were trying to be saviors. It was because they stayed, they listened, they cared, even when there was nothing to gain from it. In the middle of the scrolling, Keanu noticed a reply that stopped him cold. It was from a young woman who had grown up in a war-torn country. She wrote, "There was an old TV in the shelter. It only worked sometimes. But one night they played a movie. I don't remember the plot. I don't even remember all the faces. But I remember one man smiled, a real smile, like he wasn't afraid of hope. I carried that smile with me through the darkest years. It reminded me that good still existed." Keanu closed his eyes for a long moment, letting her words wash over him. It could have been any movie, any moment. But it wasn't about the film. It was about the fact that something as small as a flickering image, a smile given freely, could plant seeds in the heart of someone halfway across the world. Seeds that grew even in the coldest ground. Seeds that could save a life. Opening his eyes again, Keanu found himself whispering, almost without realizing it. "Be the smile," he said. Not the hero, not the headline, just the smile. The small proof that goodness still breathed somewhere, even when the world forgot how to hope. And somewhere, in a battered orphanage, a boy named Mateo was carrying that hope still. It humbled him more than he could say. Keanu continued scrolling, finding more glimpses into lives stitched back together by the quiet kindness of strangers. There was a recurring pattern to these stories, he noticed. The heroes weren't superheroes. They weren't powerful. They weren't rich. They were teachers who stayed after the bell rang to check on a struggling student. Bus drivers who kept an extra sandwich tucked away for a kid who never seemed to have lunch. Janitors who said, "I see you," with a simple nod when everyone else looked away. One comment came from an elderly man who had been orphaned during World War II. "The world taught me to expect cruelty," he wrote. "But one day a nurse at the refugee camp gave me a pair of worn-out shoes, smiled, and said, 'Run fast, little one.' I believed her. I'm still running today." Another reply said simply, "Sometimes it's not the people we meet that save us. It's the ones we believe exist." Keanu paused on that comment. Mateo never really thought he would meet him, but he needed to believe someone like Keanu existed. Someone good, someone steady, someone who proved that the world could still be beautiful, even when everything else felt broken. Keanu thought about that long and hard as he closed the forum and looked out the window toward the gray morning sky. Mateo had clung to a photograph, not because it was perfect, not because it promised anything, but because it symbolized something too rare to lose: hope. And now, Keanu realized, hope needed to be returned, multiplied, passed forward, not by grand speeches, not by handing out gifts in front of cameras, but by sitting down next to a boy who had already fought his own wars and simply saying, "I see you. I believe in you. And you are not alone." This may be the simplest way to change the world, one unseen heart at a time. And today, it would start with Mateo. The rain had finally thinned into a mist by the time Keanu and Mateo sat at one of the battered picnic tables under a sagging awning behind the orphanage. One of the volunteers, an older woman with kind eyes, placed 2 paper cups of coffee and 2 simple sandwiches on the table with a soft nod before retreating. Mateo's hands shook slightly as he picked up the sandwich, though he tried to hide it. Keanu made no comment, no gesture that might embarrass him. He simply waited, letting the silence do what words could not. After a few moments, Mateo looked up from under his dark fringe of hair. "My mother," he began haltingly. "She died when I was 5. Fever. We didn't have money for doctors. His fingers traced the edge of the photo again, worn so thin that parts of the image had faded into ghostly shadows. My father? Mateo hesitated, swallowing hard. He tried to take care of me, but he got into bad things, bad people. One day he left to find work. He never came back. Keanu nodded slowly, every line of his face etched with patient empathy. He bounced around after that, different shelters, different homes, some good, some, Mateo's voice broke off. Keanu didn't push him to continue. Mateo wiped at his eyes roughly with the sleeve of his thin jacket. There were nights, he whispered, when I thought maybe I didn't matter at all. Like the world had decided to forget I was even here. The coffee between them grew cold. Keanu leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, lowering his voice like one would speaking to a wounded bird. You mattered, Keanu said gently. You matter. The simple truth of those words seemed to hit Mateo harder than any speech ever could. He dropped his head, breathing unevenly for a few moments. When he finally lifted his gaze again, there was a flicker of something behind the exhaustion, a flicker of belief. Mateo pushed the sandwich aside, his appetite long forgotten. He sat quietly, drawing circles with his fingertip in the condensation pooling on the table. You know, he said after a long while, I used to sneak into the old theater down the street. They showed movies for free sometimes, especially the old ones. Nobody paid to see anymore. Keanu smiled gently, waiting. I didn't care what it was, science fiction, action, whatever. For 2 hours, the world didn't feel so heavy, Mateo said, his voice steadier now. The first time I saw your movie, it was The Matrix. I didn't understand all of it, but there was something in it, something about fighting even when everything says you shouldn't. He paused, eyes distant. That's what kept me going sometimes, thinking that maybe, just maybe, if people like that could exist in a movie, maybe somewhere, someone like that existed for real. Keanu felt a lump rising in his throat he didn't expect. He had made 1,000 films, walked 1,000 red carpets, smiled for 1,000 cameras. But sitting here, in this crumbling orphanage, facing a boy who had clung to a single image of hope for survival, it all felt different, more real than any of it. Mateo's shoulders sagged, years of unspoken exhaustion pressing down on him. I didn't need anyone to save me, Mateo said quietly. I just needed to believe there was something worth surviving for. Keanu rested his palm flat on the table, close but not touching, an anchor between them. You're stronger than you know, Mateo, Keanu said in a voice barely louder than the rain dripping from the awning. You fought battles no one could see, and you won. For the first time, Mateo let out a shaky laugh, small but real. You make it sound brave, Mateo said, almost shyly. Keanu's eyes softened. It is brave, he said. Surviving is the bravest thing of all. Mateo picked at the corner of his sleeve, his fingers fidgeting as if unsure what to do with this sudden kindness. He stared at Keanu for a long moment, as if memorizing his face, unsure if this was a dream that would vanish when he blinked. You know, Mateo whispered, for a long time I thought maybe there was something wrong with me. Like, why was I the one left behind? Keanu leaned back slightly, giving Mateo the space to say what he needed. No pressure, no judgment. Oh, the good ones went away, Mateo continued. My parents, some of my friends, even some of the people at the shelters. And I kept thinking, maybe I wasn't good enough to go with them. His voice cracked, barely a thread of sound now. But then I thought, if I stay, maybe I'm supposed to do something. Maybe I'm supposed to be the good one for someone else. Keanu nodded slowly, his heart breaking and swelling at the same time. You already are, Keanu said. You're the proof that kindness survives, even when everything else tries to tear it away. Mateo blinked rapidly, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. He wiped his sleeve roughly across his face, embarrassed, but Keanu didn't look away or pity him. He just stood. For the first time in a long time, Mateo wasn't invisible. For the first time in years, someone saw him, not as a charity case, not as someone broken, but as someone whole, someone worthy. The orphanage supervisor poked her head into the room, signaling that it was time for Keanu's scheduled departure. A car waited. A camera crew was preparing elsewhere. But Keanu stayed seated. He slid a small piece of paper across the table to Mateo. On it, a phone number. No fanfare, no promises he couldn't keep. Just a door left open. "If you ever need someone to remind you who you are," Keanu said gently, "you call. Anytime." Mateo stared at the paper as if it were a key to a door he never believed existed. He clutched it in one hand, the battered photo of Keanu still in the other, and smiled, a real, trembling smile. "Thank you," he said. Keanu smiled back, warm and steady. "No, Mateo," he said quietly. "Thank you." Then, for a moment, neither spoke. They just sat together, letting the weight of grief, survival, and hope settle between them, woven into something new and indestructible. At beginning, the sun dipped lower in the sky, washing the crumbling courtyard in a soft golden light. The sound of distant traffic murmured at the edge of the city, but inside the walls of the orphanage, it felt like time itself had paused. Keanu stood for a moment, looking at the waiting black car near the gate. His team hovered awkwardly, uncertain whether to insist he leave for his next engagement. He gave them a simple wave, a silent command that said everything. Not today. Today, the schedule didn't matter. Mateo mattered. Keanu walked back to the courtyard, brushing dirt from a spot on the ground before sitting cross-legged, his jacket pooling behind him. Mateo followed, tentative at first, then sat down too, mirroring Keanu's posture like a nervous echo. For a few seconds, they just sat in silence. The warm evening breeze stirred bits of paper and dust around them. Children's laughter floated from another wing of the orphanage, faint and fleeting. Mateo took a deep breath, gathering himself, then began to speak. He spoke not like someone used to being heard, but like someone who had learned to tuck words away until they were too heavy to carry. He spoke about nights spent staring at cracked ceilings, wondering why families chose other children instead of him. About watching birthdays pass with no visitors, pretending he didn't care. About teachers who tried, social workers who burned out, and moments when a kind gesture, a sandwich left on a doorstep, a coat handed through a fence, kept him from slipping entirely into despair. Keanu listened, unmoving, his entire body focused on Mateo's words, offering the rarest and most precious thing: complete, undivided attention. There was no rush in Keanu's face, no glance at a watch, no polite nodding to speed Mateo along. Just presence. As Mateo talked, the walls he had built around himself began to show cracks. His voice shook when he spoke about the one friend he almost had, a boy who was adopted but never looked back. He smiled sadly when he spoke about finding the magazine photo, Keanu's face half torn by water damage, and how he hid it under his pillow like a secret beacon. "I used to think," Mateo said, his voice small and rough, "that if someone like you could be real, maybe goodness wasn't just something in movies." Keanu swallowed hard, feeling the weight of those words settle deep in his chest. He thought about all the roles he had played, all the stories he had helped tell. He had never imagined that somewhere, a forgotten boy was holding on to a torn photo of him like a lifeline. The sunset sank deeper, bleeding colors into the sky. Shadows stretched across the courtyard, long and soft. And still, Keanu stayed. Still, he listened. Mateo paused, wiping at his face with the sleeve of his shirt. He didn't apologize for the tears. He didn't need to. Keanu said nothing, only leaned forward slightly, letting his presence say what words never could. "I'm still here. Keep going. I used to imagine that, if we ever met," Mateo whispered, "I'd have something cool to say, something brave. He laughed, the sound fragile and self-conscious. But all I really want to say is, thank you for not being like the others, for playing people who care. Keanu's eyes didn't leave his. Those characters, Mateo said, voice cracking again. They felt like friends when I didn't have any. Keanu nodded, slowly, with a gravity Mateo felt down to his bones. You were never alone, Keanu finally said, voice low and steady. Even when it felt like the world forgot, you were still here. And that matters. Mateo blinked rapidly, as if unsure whether he'd heard correctly. Keanu reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, folded handkerchief. He passed it to the boy gently, without pity, just a quiet kindness that asked for nothing in return. I don't know what happens next for you, Keanu said softly, but I believe in it. I believe in you. The words settled into Mateo like rain on dry earth. No one had said they believed in him before. Not like this. Not while sitting cross-legged in the dust. They stayed that way for another hour, sometimes talking, sometimes just letting the wind fill the silence. Occasionally, a younger child wandered near and then tiptoed away, sensing something sacred unfolding. Eventually, the orphanage director came out to check on them, hesitating at the edge of the courtyard before gently signaling to Keanu's team that dinner was being prepared. But Keanu didn't stand up yet. Or it was something else he needed to say. You're not defined by what you've lost, he said. You're defined by how you carry it, and how you use it to help others. Mateo sat very still, absorbing every word, and for the first time in a long time, the weight he carried didn't feel like it belonged only to him. The sun had nearly dipped below the treetops when Mateo finally shifted his posture, sitting a little straighter. His voice came quieter now, but steadier. I used to think being invisible meant I was weak, that if no one saw me, maybe I didn't matter. He looked at the dirt between his shoes. But today, you looked. And now I don't feel invisible anymore. Keanu gave a small nod, then gently placed his hand over Mateo's shoulder. No performance, no spotlight, just one soul anchoring another. Mateo glanced at the photo again, still folded between his fingers. I used to look at this picture and wonder what kind of man you really were. Not the actor, the man. He turned to Keanu and said with quiet certainty, Now, I know. Keanu didn't smile. He didn't need to. His eyes reflected the kind of emotion that only silence could hold, without spilling. He finally rose, brushing off his pants, but not with the urgency of someone moving on. I have to go soon, he said gently, but I want to leave something behind, something more than words. Mateo looked up, confused. Keanu stepped back into the orphanage briefly and returned a few minutes later with a small envelope. Inside was a hand-drawn map, a stamped letter, and a name of a counselor Keanu had once met. Someone who ran a scholarship initiative for youth who'd aged out of care. This isn't a gift, Keanu said. It's an invitation. You still have time to build your future, Mateo. And you don't have to do it alone. Mateo opened the envelope with shaking hands. His lips moved slightly as he read, but no sound came out. He held it to his chest like it was a piece of his own story returned to him. Keanu didn't ask for a thank you. He didn't pose for photos or wait for recognition. He just said one final thing. Sometimes, believing in someone is the beginning of everything. As he turned to leave, a few children ran up to wave goodbye, but Mateo stayed rooted in place, watching, not just with awe, but with the first glimmer of something stronger. And in that courtyard, beneath the soft haze of twilight, the boy who once felt forgotten realized he had been seen all along. He just hadn't known it yet. The car waited at the edge of the orphanage gate, engine idling quietly, headlights faint against the soft curtain of dusk. Keanu paused before stepping in. His hand rested on the door handle, but his mind hadn't followed. Something pulled at him, a sense that this wasn't the kind of moment you left behind with a simple wave and a closed door. He turned back. Mateo still stood in the courtyard, one hand clenched loosely around the envelope. He hadn't moved much, but something in his face had changed. The boy who once seemed to shrink into the shadows was now standing in the open, no longer hiding behind silence or old fears. Keanu walked back toward him slowly, each step deliberate, like he didn't want to break the stillness that had settled between them. They met again near the place they'd sat earlier, where the dust still held the faint outlines of where they'd rested. Keanu didn't say anything right away. He just looked at Mateo. Really looked. Not like an actor meeting a fan, not like a guest saying goodbye, but like a man seeing someone he wished he'd known all along. Then, quietly, so only Mateo could hear, Keanu said, "I believe in you." 3 words, no more. But Mateo's breath caught in his chest. His lips parted slightly, and the shine in his eyes deepened. Not the wild glimmer of shock, but something quieter, something sacred, like the part of him that had been waiting his whole life to hear those words had finally been called by name. For a moment he didn't know what to do. No one had ever said that to him, not without conditions, not without expecting something in return. And yet, standing there in the twilight with Keanu, he didn't feel pressure. He didn't feel small. He felt chosen, seen, trusted. A tear slipped down his cheek, and this time he didn't wipe it away. "I won't forget," Mateo whispered. Keanu gave a slight nod, the kind that said, "I know." Then he reached out one last time and rested his hand gently over Mateo's heart. "That promise isn't just for today," he said softly. "It's for every day after this, until you believe it yourself." Mateo didn't speak again. He couldn't. But as Keanu turned and finally walked back toward the waiting car, something in the boy began to rise. Not pride, not confidence. Conviction, the kind that grows slowly, quietly, but never leaves. And in the silence that followed, the courtyard held its breath, as if even the world wanted to remember this moment. The ride back to the hotel was silent. Keanu leaned his forehead lightly against the cool window pane, watching the orphanage grow smaller in the distance until it disappeared behind a curve of the road. He thought about Mateo, how a single encounter had shifted something inside him. Not in a grand, world-changing way, but in the way that mattered most. Quietly. When Keanu arrived at the hotel, he didn't go straight to his room. Instead, he wandered to the outdoor terrace overlooking the dim city lights. The sky above was a deep velvet, scattered with faint stars, barely piercing through the haze. He sat down on a simple bench and pulled out his phone, fingers hesitating for a long moment over the screen. This wasn't something he could assign to a publicist. It wasn't a project. It wasn't a campaign. It was a promise. Keanu opened his secure contacts and found the name of an old friend, someone he trusted deeply, someone who knew how to get things done without questions or publicity. He typed slowly, choosing each word with care. Need to set up private educational support for a young man, overseas. Discretion is critical. No press, no credits, just action. We'll send details soon. He stared at the message before hitting send, feeling the finality of it settle in his chest. It wasn't about saving someone. Mateo didn't need saving. It was about watering a seed that had been buried too long beneath doubt and loneliness. Keanu leaned back, letting the night air brush across his face. A quiet kind of peace settled in his bones, the kind that came not from being seen, but from seeing someone else clearly for the first time. He thought about all the roles he had played, all the scripts he had memorized. None of them compared to this moment. No story, no movie could ever capture the truth of what it meant to quietly believe in another human being when no one was watching. The terrace lights flickered once, as if the building itself were nodding to the small decision made under its roof. Keanu smiled faintly, a smile only the stars witnessed. In the morning, he would work with his team to set up a scholarship fund in Mateo's name. Not a handout, but a bridge. Opportunities tucked quietly into his path, waiting for him to find them, waiting for him to believe he deserved them. But tonight wasn't about planning. It wasn't about logistics. It was about honoring the moment for what it was. A promise made not with fanfare, but with faith. Keanu rose from the bench after a while, pocketing his phone. As he walked back inside, he carried no trophies, no photos, no souvenirs from the day. Just a deep, quiet certainty that somewhere out there, a boy now knew, really knew, that he was believed in. And sometimes, Keanu thought, that was the greatest gift you could ever give. The next morning, Keanu rose before the sun. He moved through the hotel room quietly, packing his small bag with the ease of someone used to traveling light. Yet today, everything felt heavier. Not burdensome, just meaningful. Like the weight of a vow, tucked invisibly inside his chest. He left a handwritten note at the hotel front desk, addressed to Sister Clara at the orphanage. It was simple, just a few lines. Thank you for tending to the seeds the world forgot. Keep going. You are not alone. No signature, no sender, just the words. By the time the city stirred awake, Keanu was already on the road to the airport. His team kept the conversation light, filling the car ride with updates about schedules and upcoming commitments. Keanu nodded occasionally, polite but distant, his mind still tracing the memory of Mateo's face. At the terminal, as crowds bustled around him, Keanu found a quiet corner and sat down. He pulled out his phone again, this time opening a private folder where he kept personal notes. Things no assistant or agent ever saw. He created a new entry. At the top, he wrote, Mateo. Beneath it, he listed 3 simple reminders. Set up scholarship fund, no traceable ties. Explore mentorship opportunities through trusted foundations. Annual check-ins, anonymously. He saved the note, then slipped the phone back into his jacket. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about managing Mateo's life. It was about making sure that when the boy stumbled, as everyone does, there would be a hand, unseen but steady, ready to lift him without ever asking for recognition. When Keanu boarded the plane, he didn't look back at the city skyline shrinking below. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to hold on to the feeling of that dusty courtyard, that fragile voice saying, "Now I don't feel invisible anymore." Somewhere far below, a boy was waking up to a new day, clutching a letter and a map that pointed toward a future he never thought he'd be allowed to dream about. And somewhere in the vast, unseen web that connected strangers across the world, a single thread had been tied. A bond woven not by blood or fame, but by something purer. Keanu opened his eyes as the plane leveled out over the clouds. He didn't smile. He didn't need to, because deep inside, he knew. Promises made in the dark have a way of lighting the world, one soul at a time. The plane touched down with a soft jolt, and Keanu moved through the airport like a shadow, unnoticed by most. His hat was pulled low, his steps unhurried. But inside he carried a growing sense of unfinished business. Later that evening, alone in his quiet home, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between his hands. He thought about Mateo, about the invisible ways people are saved every day without fanfare. He thought about the lifelines that are thrown across oceans and cities without either side ever really knowing it. Opening his laptop, Keanu logged into a small, private account he used for quiet outreach. No verification checkmarks, no publicity, just a place where he could still be human. He clicked into a simple message board tied to a foundation he supported. A place for people to share stories, to find connection in the small, unseen moments that often go unnoticed by the world. He'd stared at the blinking cursor for a long time before typing. "If you could say one thing to someone who unknowingly saved you," he wrote slowly, "what would it be?" He read the words once, twice, then hit post without overthinking it. No signature, no hint of who was asking, just the question. He closed the laptop halfway and leaned back in his chair, wondering if anyone would answer, wondering if anyone else had once been lifted by a stranger's kindness without the chance to say the words they had carried for years. It didn't take long. Within minutes, the first comment appeared. "I would say, thank you for seeing the part of me I thought was invisible." Another followed. "To the teacher who noticed I stopped smiling. You saved my life and never even knew." The messages kept coming, like water finding every crack, every hidden place where loneliness had settled. The stories poured out. One woman shared how a cashier's unexpected compliment had stopped her from ending her life that night. A man wrote about a childhood neighbor who always left a sandwich at the fence when his parents forgot to feed him. A soldier spoke of a woman who had simply smiled at him on the subway when he thought he had nothing left to live for. Keanu read each one slowly, carefully, letting the weight of them settle over him like a heavy but welcome rain. The thread grew longer by the hour. Hundreds of replies, thousands of likes and quiet acknowledgments. No arguments, no debates. Just raw, aching gratitude spilling into the open where it could finally breathe. It was humbling, Keanu thought, how so many of the greatest acts of rescue were ones the rescuers never even realized they had performed. How many lives had been saved by a word, a glance, a simple act of decency? How often do we pass by our own miracles without even knowing we are someone's reason for holding on? Keanu refreshed the page again. New comments blinked into existence, each one a small confession, a small offering from someone who had carried silent gratitude for years. One message stopped him cold. It simply read, "Thank you for being the reason I stayed one more day." No elaborate story, no details, just that. He stared at the words for a long time, feeling their weight settle deep in his chest. Somewhere out there, a moment of kindness, a word, a smile, a presence, had bought someone another day of life. And maybe that extra day had led to another and another, until life had built itself quietly around that invisible act of grace. He thought about Mateo again, about the boy clutching that weathered photo through years of loneliness, holding on not to a man, but to the idea that goodness could be real. Mateo had survived not because someone saved him with grand gestures, but because someone unknowingly reminded him to keep believing. Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, letting the hum of the night settle around him. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, rustling the branches like whispered prayers. He reopened his laptop and typed a quiet response beneath that haunting message. "Sometimes," he wrote, "your presence is the only lighthouse someone can see through their storm." He didn't sign it, didn't claim ownership. It wasn't about him. It was about honoring the invisible hands that hold up the world when no one else is looking. The responses to the original prompt kept growing. Some stories were long, stretching paragraphs down the screen. Others were just a line or two, but all of them shared the same heartbeat, the desperate, beautiful need to be seen, to be remembered, to say thank you to the moments that made survival possible. A nurse wrote about a patient who once squeezed her hand during a dark shift when she doubted her career. A young man thanked a stranger who gave him a ride home one icy night, not realizing he had been planning to run away for good. A mother shared how a kind word from a grocery store clerk helped her find strength to leave an abusive home. Keanu read until his eyes blurred with exhaustion and emotion. He saw himself reflected in their stories, not as the savior, but as the one who had also at times needed the quiet kindness of strangers to carry him forward. Long after midnight, he finally closed the laptop, resting his hand on its cover, like he was closing the pages of a shared diary. The question he had asked lingered in the air, fuller now, heavier and more beautiful than when he had first typed it. If you could say one thing to someone who unknowingly saved you, what would it be? Keanu didn't need to post an answer of his own. He carried it silently, tucked away with all the other promises made in quiet corners of the world. And somewhere out there, he knew Mateo was part of that chain now too, a living testament to the power of belief, given freely, asking nothing in return. The night settled fully around him, thick and gentle. Tomorrow would bring new tasks, new challenges, but tonight, Keanu allowed himself to simply sit with the truth of it all. That even in a world full of noise and distraction, one act of unseen kindness could still echo louder than anything else. The first letter arrived 2 weeks after Keanu left. Mateo found it tucked carefully under his thin dormitory pillow, placed there sometime during the morning when he had been helping Sister Clara fix the courtyard fence. It was a plain envelope, no return address, no official stamp, just his name written carefully across the front in a handwriting he didn't recognize. He opened it slowly, fingers trembling a little. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded neatly. Dear Mateo, we see the potential in you. A scholarship opportunity has been made available should you wish to pursue it. No strings attached, no expectations, only hope. If you are interested, there will be more information coming soon. Believe in your future. You are worth it. Mateo read the words over and over, not sure at first if it was real. His mind raced with questions. Was this some kind of mistake? Had the letter been meant for someone else? Who would invest in someone like him, a boy from a crumbling orphanage on the outskirts of a forgotten city? But no one else at the orphanage had received a letter. Only him. He tucked the paper carefully back into the envelope and hid it inside his mattress, uncertain whether to tell anyone. A part of him was afraid it would disappear if he spoke it aloud. The next day, Sister Clara handed him a second envelope after breakfast. This one contained brochures, opportunities for scholarship programs, mentorship initiatives, and letters from foundations that helped youth like him transition into higher education. Again, there were no explanations, no signatures, just the quiet insistence that someone, somewhere, believed he was worth investing in. Mateo carried the materials to the empty courtyard after lunch and sat cross-legged in the dusty shade, spreading the brochures out in front of him. His hands hovered over the pages like he was afraid to smudge them. Each program described a future he had never dared to imagine for himself. Counseling degrees, youth advocacy work, mentorship, apprenticeships, opportunities that didn't just lift him out of the orphanage, but invited him to help others once he was ready. He read every word slowly, carefully, absorbing the possibilities like a man starving for hope. And slowly, a new feeling began to bloom inside him. Not pity, not charity, but something far stronger, empowerment. Someone out there believed he could be more than the life he had been given. Someone had decided he was worth growing, worth nurturing, worth giving a future that didn't begin and end inside these battered walls. Mateo sat in the golden afternoon light, the brochures fluttering softly around him in the breeze, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to dream without shame. Over the next few weeks, the letters kept coming. Sometimes it was just a short note with words of encouragement. Other times it was an information packet about educational grants, workshops, and programs geared toward young people who had aged out of foster care or orphanages. Every envelope was unsigned. Every message was simple, direct, and full of quiet faith in him. At first, Mateo thought it might have been Sister Clara, but when he asked her gently one afternoon while helping prepare food for the younger children, she only smiled and shook her head. "Seeds are planted by hands we never see," she said softly. "It's not the hand that matters. It's the life that grows." Mateo carried her words with him as he carried the letters back to his room, tucking them carefully into a worn shoebox he kept under his bed. The box became his treasure chest, a secret collection of proof that somewhere, someone, believed he mattered. He didn't tell the other kids about the letters, not because he wanted to hide them out of selfishness, but because the gift felt too sacred to parade around. It wasn't about showing off. It wasn't about shouting to the world that someone had finally seen him. It was about something quieter, deeper, the slow, healing realization that he had been worthy all along, even before the letters had come. He started to change in small ways. He rose earlier, taking extra time to help Sister Clara organize the food pantry. He spent afternoons helping the younger children with their reading, patiently sounding out difficult words with them. He found himself smiling more often, not the guarded, hesitant smile he used to wear like armor, but a real one. Open, unafraid. One evening, sitting on the courtyard bench with a few of the little ones climbing over him, Mateo caught his reflection in a cracked window pane. For a moment, he didn't recognize himself. He saw a young man with tired eyes but a strong spirit. A young man who had been knocked down more times than he could count, but who kept getting up anyway. A young man who, against all odds, was still standing. Still hoping. Still believing. When the next letter came, it wasn't just an offer of scholarships. It was a personal invitation to a mentorship program designed to guide young people through the transition into independent life. There was even a voucher for new clothes, travel expenses covered, and a handwritten encouragement at the bottom of the page. You are not alone on this road. Mateo pressed the letter to his chest and closed his eyes. For the first time, he wasn't just dreaming about a different life. He was stepping into it. The decision to say yes came quietly, without fanfare. One morning, long before the sun climbed over the rooftops, Mateo sat at the courtyard's edge, the latest letter open in his lap. Around him, the world was still and hushed, the first golden light just beginning to bleed into the sky. He held a pen in one hand, a simple piece of lined paper in the other. His fingers hovered for a moment, unsure, before he finally began to write. Dear benefactor, I don't know who you are. I don't know why you chose me. But I want you to know, I will not waste this. Thank you for believing when I couldn't. He folded the letter neatly, though he had no address to send it to. Instead, he tucked it into the shoebox with the others, as a quiet promise to himself and to whoever was out there planting seeds in his life. By the time Sister Clara found him in the courtyard, Mateo was already gathering the brochures and letters into a neat stack. I'm ready, he said simply, without hesitation. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't ask why. She only placed her hands on his shoulders, looked into his eyes, and smiled with a kind of pride that needed no words. In the days that followed, preparations moved quickly. Paperwork was completed, arrangements were made. New clothes, simple but clean, arrived in a plain box with no sender's name. A bus ticket appeared with a handwritten note clipped to it. Every great journey begins with a single brave step. The morning Mateo left the orphanage, the children gathered to wave him off, their small hands clutching paper flowers they had made the night before. Mateo crouched down to hug them all, promising to write, promising to come back one day. But in his heart, he knew he wasn't just leaving a place behind. He was leaving behind the version of himself that had once believed he was invisible. As the bus rumbled down the long road away from the orphanage, Mateo pressed his forehead against the cool window and watched the world open up before him. For the first time, the horizon didn't look like an unreachable line between dreams and reality. It looked like a beginning planted by invisible hands, a beginning watered by quiet belief. And somewhere, far beyond the hills and the dusty roads, Mateo knew, without needing proof, that someone was still out there, rooting for him. Someone who had believed he was worth more than survival. Someone who had planted the seeds that were now, finally, beginning to bloom. The bus station smelled faintly of oil and coffee, a strange mix that clung to the early morning air. Mateo stepped down onto the platform with his small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, a folded paper map tucked into his back pocket, and a heart pounding with something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A woman holding a clipboard spotted him and waved. She was from the Scholarship Foundation, her warm smile easing some of the tightness in his chest. Mateo walked toward her, his footsteps slow but steady, each one carrying him further from the life he had survived and closer to the life he was about to build. She greeted him by name without hesitation and led him to a waiting van with a few other young people who looked just as nervous and uncertain as he felt. No one spoke much during the ride. Instead, they all stared out the windows, watching the cityscape blur past, each lost in their own fragile hopes. The van pulled up to a sprawling campus tucked between rows of tall trees. It wasn't grand or intimidating. It looked worn in a comforting way, like a place that had seen dreams begin, falter, and rise again. A banner fluttered across the main entrance, Youth Empowerment and Counseling Program, Fall Intake. Mateo tightened his grip on the duffel strap and stepped out. The orientation was simple, kind. No grand speeches, just people who spoke plainly about what they believed in. That brokenness was not weakness, and that the hardest beginnings often built the strongest foundations. Mateo listened carefully as they explained the program. It wasn't just about academics. It was about learning to use empathy as a tool for healing. It was about turning survival into strength, scars into bridges for others. When they asked each participant to introduce themselves and share why they were there, Mateo's throat tightened. He listened as others spoke of foster homes, lost siblings, years spent feeling unseen. When it was his turn, he rose slowly, his palms damp. "My name is Mateo," he said, voice rough but steady. "And I'm here because once someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I want to do that for someone else. I want to be the person I once needed." The room was silent for a moment. Then the program director, a tall man with kind eyes, gave a small nod. "Welcome home," he said simply. Mateo sat back down, heart hammering against his ribs, but lighter somehow, as if a door had swung open inside him that had been closed for years. He was no longer the boy waiting for a miracle. He was the young man becoming one. Classes started the next day, and Mateo threw himself into them with a hunger he hadn't felt since he was a little boy, before the world had taught him to expect disappointment. The subjects weren't easy: child psychology, trauma-informed care, conflict resolution, words and concepts that sometimes tangled together in his mind like threads in a too tight knot. But Mateo kept at it. He stayed after lectures to ask questions. He read chapters twice, sometimes 3 times, until the ideas didn't just make sense, but settled somewhere deep inside him. What surprised him most wasn't how difficult it was how much of it he already understood without ever being formally taught. When the instructors talked about children feeling invisible, about how small kindnesses could shift the course of a life, Mateo didn't have to imagine it. He had lived it. He had been the boy sitting alone at recess, the boy who flinched when someone raised their voice, the boy who clung to a tattered photo because it was proof that somewhere goodness existed. Now, as he sat in the lecture halls, Mateo realized his greatest qualification wasn't written on a resume or tucked inside an academic transcript. It was written in the invisible ink of survival, compassion, and quiet resilience. He could spot the sadness behind a smile. He could hear the fear tucked into a trembling voice. He knew the difference between a child acting out for attention and a child acting out because they didn't know how else to say, "I'm scared." During group exercises, Mateo found himself naturally stepping into a leadership role, not by force, not by loudness, but by listening first, speaking second. He remembered how Keanu had listened to him that day in the courtyard, offering presence instead of solutions, patience instead of pity. Mateo carried that lesson into every interaction. He wasn't there to fix anyone. He was there to see them, to hear, to remind them they were not alone. The program assigned each student a mentor, an older counselor who had once been through the same path. Mateo's mentor was a woman named Elena, a former foster youth who now worked with teenagers aging out of the system. She met with him once a week, their conversations ranging from study strategies to life philosophies. "You have something you can't teach," Alina said one afternoon as they sat under a tree on campus. "You have walked through the fire, and you came out carrying buckets of water for others." Mateo didn't know what to say. He only nodded, feeling the truth of it settle inside him. He was no longer just surviving. He was beginning. And somewhere, far away, he knew someone else. Someone he would never name. Someone who had once believed in him without asking for anything back, was still quietly rooting for him. The months passed quietly, marked not by grand events but by small, steady victories. Mateo passed his first major exam with a score higher than he had dared to hope. He helped lead a support group exercise where he guided younger students through sharing their fears without shame. He learned how to design lesson plans, how to build trust slowly and patiently, how to sit with someone's pain without rushing to erase it. He also learned how to sit with his own. Some nights, lying in the small bed of his dorm room, Mateo would take out the shoebox he had carried with him from the orphanage. He would unfold the letters, smoothing their worn edges, and read them all over again. Each word reminded him of where he had come from. Each promise of belief reminded him of where he was going. He began volunteering at a local community center on weekends, working with children who had backgrounds as rough as his own. He taught them to trust their own voices, to believe in their own worth, even when the world around them said otherwise. At first, the children were hesitant, watching him with wary eyes, but Mateo understood. He remembered what it was like to expect abandonment. He remembered what it was like to flinch from hope. So he stayed patient. He showed up every Saturday, rain or shine, sitting cross-legged on the floor and listening without judgment. He taught them that their stories mattered, that their feelings were real, and that they were allowed to dream bigger than the limits life had placed on them. And slowly, the walls began to fall. One afternoon, a little boy named Diego, no older than 9, pressed a hand-drawn picture into Mateo's palm. It was a clumsy sketch of the two of them sitting together under a tree, big smiles on their faces. "You're like a real hero," Diego said, cheeks flushing with shyness. Mateo knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "No," he said gently. "You are." As he tucked the drawing carefully into his bag that night, Mateo felt a kind of peace he had never known before. He wasn't trying to become someone else's version of success. He wasn't trying to outrun his past. He was living the future he had once only dared to hope for. A future built not on fame, not on fortune, but on quiet moments of connection. A future where he became the person he had once needed most. And somewhere, Mateo believed, that silent benefactor who had once planted seeds in the dark was still out there, smiling, watching those seeds grow into something strong and beautiful. A new beginning had taken root, and it was only just beginning. The years moved quietly, as they often do when real change is unfolding. Mateo grew into his work, one small act of kindness at a time. He finished his program with high marks, accepted a mentorship position with the very foundation that had once sent him that first anonymous letter, and began dedicating his life to kids who lived in the cracks of the world. What Mateo never knew, what he never suspected, was that somewhere a silent presence continued to walk beside him. Every year, without fail, Keanu returned to the orphanage. He never announced himself, never asked for recognition. He simply appeared during the quieter seasons, when the city's noise had died down and the days stretched lazy and long across the courtyard. He would park a borrowed car several streets away, slip through side paths only Sister Clara knew about, and watch from a distance. From behind the safety of the old crumbling garden wall, Keanu would see the changes. The broken swings Mateo once sat on had been repaired. The peeling murals were bright again, painted with careful, clumsy hands. The laughter was louder, freer. Even the flowers in the neglected patches of earth seemed to stand a little taller. Keanu would lean against the wall, hands tucked deep in his jacket pockets, and let himself simply witness it. Not the glory, not the thanks, the growth. He never stayed long, sometimes an hour, sometimes just enough to watch the kids chase each other across the courtyard, or see Sister Clara leading a prayer circle beneath the gnarled old tree. And always, tucked somewhere among the new volunteers or the growing students, he would see the smallest traces of Mateo's spirit. Still living there, still planting hope where once there had only been dust. One year, Keanu arrived just in time to catch the end of a small ceremony. The orphanage had started a tradition of celebrating students who left for higher education, small handmade certificates passed out by Sister Clara herself. Keanu stood in the shade, far from the gathering, watching as a young girl with bright eyes and trembling hands accepted her certificate. Across the courtyard, Mateo knelt down to her level and whispered something into her ear. She beamed, cheeks glowing with pride, and clutched the paper to her chest like a priceless treasure. Keanu smiled faintly, the kind of smile that lives in the corners of the heart long after it fades from the face. He didn't need to hear what Mateo had said. He already knew. It would have been the same words once given to a lonely boy in a crumbling courtyard, years before. Words that had carried Mateo through every dark night and uncertain morning. Words that now, through Mateo, would carry others. Another year passed, and Keanu returned once again. This time, the orphanage looked different. New coats of paint softened the crumbling walls. Fresh gardens had been planted near the fence line, with wildflowers sprouting defiantly between the stones. The old rusted swing set had been replaced with a newer one, bright red and blue against the dusty courtyard. Keanu found his familiar place behind the garden wall and leaned there, hands in his jacket pockets, blending into the background as children tumbled and laughed across the open yard. At first, he didn't see Mateo. He saw other volunteers, young men and women with kind faces helping the children read, paint, and play. He saw Sister Clara sitting near the kitchen door, her hands busy knitting but her eyes alert, scanning the courtyard with the practiced tenderness of someone who had built her life around watching over others. And then, near the far end of the yard, Keanu spotted him. Mateo stood with a group of teenagers, leading them through a game that involved teamwork and patience. His laughter floated across the courtyard, steady and sure. There was something in Mateo's posture that Keanu hadn't seen before. Not the cautious, guarded boy clutching a worn-out photo, but a man standing tall in his own skin, comfortable in the space he occupied. Keanu watched as Mateo knelt beside a young boy who had fallen during the game, dusting off his scraped knees and whispering something that made the boy grin through his tears. It was a simple thing, a quiet thing, but it was everything. Keanu stayed until the sun began to dip low, casting the courtyard in soft amber light. He stayed until the children were called in for supper and the courtyard grew empty except for Mateo, who lingered for a moment, watching the fading sun with a thoughtful expression. Keanu didn't call out. He didn't approach. He simply watched, feeling a kind of fullness settle over him that words could never reach. He had never needed to be thanked. He had never needed Mateo to know he was there. It was enough to see the life that had blossomed from one small act of belief. Before he left, Keanu slipped a small package through the gap in the garden wall. A new set of books for the orphanage library, carefully selected for young readers and dreamers alike. No note, no signature. Just another silent gift, left in a world that so often forgot to notice the quiet ones. As Keanu walked away under the darkening sky, he smiled to himself, knowing that the seeds he had planted had long since taken root. And the harvest was growing beautifully, far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. The visits became a rhythm, an unspoken tradition that neither Mateo nor the others ever knew about. Once a year, Keanu would find his way back to that small orphanage, no matter where life had taken him in the months between. Whether filming halfway across the world or speaking at quiet gatherings far from the spotlight, he made time to return. Each time, he came alone. Each time, he brought something simple: a box of art supplies, a new set of soccer balls, a few coats for the winter months. He never delivered them directly. He always left them somewhere they would be found naturally, as if they had simply appeared by the kindness of the universe itself. Mateo never questioned where the gifts came from. He only smiled when the children's faces lit up at a fresh canvas or a warm jacket. He only worked harder to make the orphanage feel less like a place people ended up in and more like a place they could begin from. He never needed to know the source of the quiet miracles, because deep down, Mateo understood something now. Kindness did not need witnesses to matter. Some of the greatest gifts are the ones that move through the world unseen, asking for nothing, leaving everything better in their wake. Keanu watched from a distance as Mateo grew into a mentor, a guide, and eventually a leader. He watched as Mateo organized reading circles under the old tree, as he built partnerships with local schools to give the kids better chances. He watched as Mateo stayed late on cold nights to help repair broken shoes, stitch torn backpacks, and braid the hair of little girls who had no mothers to do it for them. And he never once interrupted the life unfolding there. It was never about being seen. It was about seeing. One afternoon, years after that first letter had slipped under Mateo's pillow, Keanu stood once again behind the old garden wall. The flowers, planted by the children, brushed against his jacket as he leaned forward, just enough to catch a glimpse of the courtyard. Mateo was sitting on the ground with a group of new arrivals, younger children who looked scared and lost. He listened as one little girl, voice trembling, asked a question so soft that even from a distance, Keanu barely heard it. "Will it always feel like no one wants me?" Mateo's answer was immediate, without hesitation. "No," he said, voice steady. "It won't. One day you'll see that you were always wanted, always loved. You just hadn't found your people yet." Keanu closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the truth of those words wrap around him like a prayer. He turned and walked away quietly, the sound of laughter beginning to rise behind him. The world would never know the full story, and that was exactly how it should be. Mateo stood just outside the door of the small counseling room, holding a notebook in one hand and a nervous breath in the other. He had prepared for this moment for years, yet now that it was here, he felt the familiar tremble of doubt return. Would the kids listen? Would they trust him? Could he really give something back that he'd only learned how to receive recently? Inside the room, 5 chairs had been arranged in a loose circle. The walls were painted in soft pastel colors, and sunlight filtered through a single window, warming the space. A small shelf in the corner held stuffed animals, art supplies, and a few worn picture books. It wasn't much, but it felt safe. That was the goal. The children inside were quiet, watching him with wide eyes. They were all between the ages of 8 and 13, each carrying their own version of a heavy story. Mateo could see it in their posture, the way some sat rigid with folded arms, while others stared down at their shoes as if making eye contact might crack something open. He stepped in slowly, setting the notebook aside, choosing instead to sit in one of the chairs, like he wasn't there to lead, but to join. "My name is Mateo," he said softly, "and I'm not here to fix you." That got their attention. He let the words settle before continuing. "I'm here because when I was your age, I sat in a room like this. I didn't say much, I didn't trust anyone. I didn't believe someone could understand what it felt like to be passed over, forgotten, left behind." One of the older boys shifted in his seat, just slightly. "I want you to know something," Mateo said, his voice steady. "You are not broken. You are beautiful." A girl with frizzy curls and tear-streaked cheeks looked up for the first time. Her eyes didn't quite believe it, but they were listening. "I know what it feels like to think your story makes you different," he continued. "To feel like your scars disqualify you from being loved or chosen or safe. But those scars, they're not proof that you're weak. They're proof that you survived." The room stayed quiet, but the air inside it began to shift. He asked if anyone wanted to share something about themselves. Not everything, just one small thing. At first, no one moved. Then a small boy raised his hand and whispered, "My name is Levi. I don't sleep much at night." Mateo nodded. "That's okay. I used to stay awake a lot too. Sometimes the dark feels louder than the day." Another hand followed. A girl named Nina admitted she didn't like being touched, even hugs. "That's okay too," Mateo said gently. "We all carry different memories. We get to choose what helps us feel safe." He didn't rush them. He didn't ask them to open more than they wanted to. He just stayed, present, unafraid of the silence. The session unfolded slowly, like a flower coaxed open by gentle sunlight. After Levi and Nina spoke, the others began to stir. A boy named Jonah admitted he missed a dog he once had, the only living thing that ever seemed to listen to him without judgment. A quiet girl named Rosa shared that she hated holidays because they only reminded her of who wasn't there. Mateo listened to each of them without interruption, giving space to their words like precious offerings. When they finished, he leaned forward slightly, his voice low and sure. "Everything you're feeling is real," he said, "and none of it makes you less worthy of love, or safety, or belonging." He could see how some of the kids leaned into the words like someone leaning into a fire after a long, cold journey. He picked up a piece of chalk and moved to the small blackboard in the room. Without explanation, he wrote a single word: strength. He turned back to them. "When you look at each other," he said, "you might see someone small, someone hurt. But I see something else. I see strength. Not the kind that shouts and beats its chest. The kind that gets up again after falling. The kind that keeps hoping even when it hurts." The room stayed still, hanging on his every word. "I want you to remember something," Mateo said, his hand pressing flat against his own chest. "Your scars, your fears, your loneliness. They are part of your story, but they are not all of it." He gave a small, almost shy smile. "I know, because I carry those things too. And they taught me how to listen, how to care, how to stand here today with you." The group sat quieter now, but not from fear or withdrawal. From a beginning of trust. Mateo ended the session by inviting each child to draw or write something that made them feel strong, even if it was something small, even if it was something no one else would understand. They got to work, slowly at first, pencils scratching hesitantly across paper, but within minutes, the room filled with the soft sounds of creation. Levi drew a shield with a crack running through it, but still standing tall. Nina wrote a poem about a tree that lost its leaves but kept its roots deep in the earth. Jonah sketched a lopsided dog, grinning wildly. When the session ended, none of them wanted to leave right away. Mateo packed up the papers carefully, promising to keep them safe until the next meeting. He watched them file out into the hallway, their heads a little higher, their shoulders a little straighter. He stayed behind for a moment, letting the empty room hum with the energy they had left behind. And for the first time in a long time, Mateo realized that healing didn't always come from grand gestures or perfect words. Sometimes, it came simply from standing in the wreckage of your own story and offering others a hand across. And knowing that was enough. The evening was unusually quiet. Mateo sat at his small desk in the modest apartment he now called home. The walls were bare except for a few framed drawings from the children he mentored, each one a reminder of how far he had come and how far he still hoped to go. Outside the window, the last colors of the sunset faded into a soft, deep blue. Mateo rested his chin in his hand, staring at a blank piece of paper lying in front of him. A simple ballpoint pen waited nearby, as if daring him to find the words he had tucked away for years. He wasn't sure what had brought him to this moment. Maybe it was the session he had led that afternoon, the raw honesty of the children sharing pieces of themselves. Maybe it was the memory of that first letter tucked under his pillow, the beginning of a different life. Maybe it was just time. Slowly, He picked up the pen. He hesitated for a few seconds, then began to write. Dear stranger, I do not know your name. I do not know your face, but I know your heart. He paused, feeling the weight of the words. They were heavier than he expected, but also lighter, somehow, once they were on the page. You stepped into my life when no one else did. Not with noise, not with demands, but with a whisper that said, you matter. I held on to that whisper like a lifeline, even when I didn't know if it was real. He stopped to breathe, steadying the rush of emotion rising in his chest. When I found your letters, something shifted inside me. It wasn't just the opportunities you gave. It was the belief. The silent, stubborn belief that someone like me was worth something. Worth more than survival. Mateo wiped at his eyes with the back of his hand, then kept writing, letting the words spill out without judgment. You changed my life without ever asking for thanks. You changed my story without ever needing to be the hero. Because of you, I found my way to this place. Because of you, I can sit in a room full of broken hearts and say, with truth, you are not broken. You are beautiful. Because once, someone said it to me, and they meant it. The ink on the page shimmered faintly under the desk lamp, each word carrying a weight too long unspoken. He sat back for a moment, staring at the letter. There was a part of him that wanted to find this person, to hand-deliver the words, to make them understand the ripple effect their kindness had unleashed. But another part of him, the wiser, quieter part, knew the truth. Some gifts are meant to remain silent. Some thank yous are carried not in public acts, but in the quiet living of a good life. Mateo smiled softly and reached for the worn leather journal he kept hidden at the back of a drawer. The journal was small, battered from years of use, its pages filled with reflections, dreams, and quiet moments Mateo never shared with anyone. It was the place he went when the weight of his memories grew too heavy to carry alone. He opened it carefully to a blank page near the middle. Gently, he folded the letter he had written and tucked it between the sheets, pressing it flat with the palm of his hand. He didn't glue it down or pin it. It didn't need to be trapped or displayed. It just needed to rest somewhere safe, somewhere real. Mateo sat back in his chair, breathing out slowly. The room seemed to exhale with him, as if even the walls understood the significance of what had just happened. He didn't feel the urgency to send the letter anymore. He didn't need to track down the mysterious benefactor or parade his gratitude before the world. The act of writing it was enough. The act of remembering was enough. He ran his fingertips lightly over the leather cover of the journal, then closed it and placed it carefully back into the drawer. He sat there for a while longer, watching the last slivers of light disappear beyond the horizon. In the dimness, memories rose up unbidden. The dusty courtyard, the sound of children laughing, the feeling of rough paper clutched in his hand on that first day the letter had arrived. Back then he had thought that being saved would feel like a grand moment, a sudden eruption of light chasing away all darkness. But now he knew better. Being saved had felt like a whisper. A small, stubborn whisper that refused to let him give up. A whisper he now carried in his own voice every time he sat with a scared child, every time he reminded someone that their story didn't end with their pain. Mateo stood up, stretching the stiffness from his muscles. He moved to the window and looked out into the night, the city lights flickering like scattered stars. He smiled to himself. A real smile, small and sure. Somewhere out there, he believed, the stranger who had once reached across the void with invisible hands was living their life, probably never knowing the full weight of what they had done. And that was okay. Not every story needed a reunion. Not every act of love needed a finish line. Some stories lived on in the quiet resilience of the people they touched. Some acts of belief echoed long after their origin was forgotten. Mateo turned away from the window, flicked off the lamp, and moved toward the small bed tucked against the wall. Tomorrow would be another day of listening, guiding, and reminding others of their worth. Tomorrow, he would continue passing forward the gift he had once been given. And that, he thought as he drifted toward sleep, was the greatest thank you he could ever offer. The idea came to Mateo one rainy afternoon as he sat in a corner booth of a small coffee shop, watching raindrops chase each other down the window pane. He had been thinking about the children he counseled, about the ones who aged out of programs with nowhere to go, about the kids who carried their dreams like fragile glass in a world that often had no place for them. He thought about himself at that age, 17, no family, clutching a tattered photograph like it was a map to a life he didn't know how to reach. What had saved him had not been a program or a rule book. It had been belief. One person believing he was worth something more. One act of kindness planted quietly without expectation. Mateo stirred his coffee absent-mindedly, then pulled a napkin toward him and began to sketch an idea. Not a charity, not a clinic, just a gathering place. A safe space where displaced youth could meet once a week, share their burdens, build friendships, and learn that being seen and heard was not a luxury, but a right. He would call it the bridge. Not because he saw himself as a savior, but because he believed healing was a path people crossed together. The next day, Mateo found a small room to rent at the local community center. It was nothing fancy, just 4 walls, a few chairs, a chalkboard, but it was a beginning. He made simple flyers by hand, no flashy graphics, no bold promises, just a few words. Looking for a safe place to talk? You're not alone. Come as you are. All are welcome. He left them at bus stops, libraries, coffee shops, wherever the city's invisible youth might pass by. He didn't know if anyone would come. The first week, 2 kids showed up. Isaiah, who had been couch surfing for months, and a girl named Lily who had aged out of foster care and was trying to find her way without falling through the cracks. Mateo welcomed them like they were old friends. They sat in the circle of chairs, their voices hesitant at first, then growing stronger as the hour wore on. They talked about favorite foods, about songs that made them feel brave, about memories they clung to on the hard days. Mateo listened more than he spoke. When the session ended, neither Isaiah nor Lily rushed to leave. They lingered, helping stack chairs, asking Mateo if they could come back next week. He smiled and said, "The door is always open." And he meant it. Word of mouth traveled faster than Mateo expected. By the 3rd week, 5 kids were sitting in the circle. By the 6th, there were 10. Some came every week without fail. Others drifted in and out like passing storms, sometimes needing only a night's worth of shelter for their spirit before moving on again. Mateo never asked questions they weren't ready to answer. He never pressed them for stories or explanations. He simply showed up. Every week, rain or shine, whether one person came or 20. He brought snacks when he could afford them. He remembered birthdays and celebrated them with small handwritten cards. He asked about tests, about job interviews, about dreams too fragile to say aloud anywhere else. The bridge became more than a room. It became a lifeline. A boy named Cameron found the courage to apply for a job after weeks of doubting he was good enough. A girl named Sophia discovered a love for painting, spending hours sketching portraits of the other members during their meetings. Another boy, Micah, who had been silent for nearly a month, finally spoke up one evening and said simply, "I feel like maybe it's okay that I'm still here." Mateo never made speeches. He never sought recognition or posted about the group online. He wasn't interested in credit. He was interested in connection. The kids didn't know much about his past, only that he seemed to understand things most adults didn't. They didn't know that he too had once sat in the dust of forgotten places, wondering if hope was just a trick played on the desperate. They only knew that he saw them, that he stayed, that he never made promises he couldn't keep, and never pretended the world was easier than it was. He taught them that healing was messy and slow, that bravery sometimes looked like just getting out of bed in the morning, that survival wasn't shameful, it was sacred. As the seasons turned, the bridge grew stronger. Some of the older kids began mentoring the younger ones, passing forward the kindness they had received. A bulletin board went up in the back of the room, covered in scribbled notes, drawings, and letters of encouragement from one member to another. It wasn't polished, it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that made it beautiful. One evening, long after the others had left, Mateo stayed behind to straighten the chairs and sweep the floor. He stood in the middle of the room, staring at the messy bulletin board with a soft smile on his face. This, he realized, was the dream. Not awards, not applause, just a handful of lives stitched back together with thread made of patience, belief, and stubborn hope. No kid should have to dream alone, Mateo thought. Not while he was still here to remind them they didn't have to. It was Sister Clara's idea first. One afternoon, after a long meeting with some of the older children and a few volunteers, she stood quietly in the middle of the courtyard, staring at the weathered wall near the entrance. The old stone was cracked and stained by years of rain and heat. Vines crept up the sides, stubborn and wild. It was a wall that had seen too many goodbyes, too many silent heartbreaks. "We need something here," Sister Clara said softly. "Something to remind them that this place is more than where they started." Word spread quickly among the children and the volunteers. Ideas were tossed around, bright murals of animals, fields of flowers, rainbows across blue skies. But in the end, it was the youngest kids who came up with the idea that everyone agreed on. A tree. Not just any tree, they said. A strong tree. A tree with roots that dug deep and branches that reached farther than the eye could see. A tree that said, even if you couldn't stay here forever, you were still part of something bigger. You were still carried forward. The mural painting began on a warm Saturday morning. The older kids helped scrub the wall clean, peeling away years of grime and chipped paint. The younger ones mixed colors in plastic tubs, their hands and faces quickly becoming streaked with green, brown, and gold. Mateo showed up early too, carrying brushes and rags. He had not been asked. He needed no invitation. This place was still woven into his bones, no matter how far he had traveled since the days he first walked its cracked pathways. He didn't take charge. He didn't direct it. He simply rolled up his sleeves, dipped his brush into a deep forest green, and began tracing wide, sweeping branches across the stone. As he worked, the courtyard filled with laughter and music from an old radio. Even the neighbors leaned over their fences to watch the transformation take shape. The trunk of the tree was thick, its bark textured with swirls and knots that hinted at storms weathered and survived. The roots dug deep below the imaginary soil line, sprawling wide and strong, anchoring the tree even when unseen. The branches stretched up and out, not in perfect symmetry, but in the wild, beautiful reach of life growing toward the sun. Handprints dotted the lower branches, small and large, each child pressing their painted palms against the wall to leave their mark. The mural didn't bear any names. No plaques. No list of donors. It didn't need them. At the very base of the tree, in small, careful letters, painted by Sister Clara's own hand, were the words that said, "Everything." For those who planted hope when nothing else grew. When the mural was finished, the children stood back and admired their work. Their laughter quieted into a soft, awed silence as they took it all in. The tree looked like it had always belonged there, like it had been waiting under the surface of the wall for someone to bring it to life. Mateo leaned against the far side of the courtyard, a brush still tucked behind one ear. His arms crossed loosely over his chest. He smiled to himself, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The tree said it all. It spoke of the people who had given without expectation, the ones who had offered belief without ever demanding recognition. It honored every hand that had ever left behind a kindness too small for the world to notice, but big enough to change a life. He saw the kids tracing the roots with their fingertips, whispering their own private prayers or wishes into the stone. He saw Sister Clara sitting in the shade, her hands resting peacefully in her lap, her face lined with the satisfaction of dreams tended carefully over decades. What moved Mateo most wasn't the beauty of the mural, though it was beautiful. It was the understanding, unspoken but deeply felt, that this legacy was not about names. It was about actions, about silent seeds planted in broken soil, about hope growing where no one thought it could. Later that evening, after the sun had dipped low and the courtyard began to empty, Mateo remained behind. The tree glowed faintly in the twilight, the painted roots seeming to stretch deeper into the earth with every passing minute. He sat cross-legged near the wall, feeling the coolness of the stone against his back. He thought about the boy he once was, the boy who had hidden in the corners of this same courtyard, clutching a photograph of a stranger he dared to believe in. He thought about the man who had once sat with him in the dust, saying nothing grand, offering only presence and a simple promise. "I believe in you." Keanu's name was not on the wall. Mateo's name was not on the wall, and that felt right, because the truest gifts often left no fingerprints. They lived on in the way a child stood a little taller, in the way someone dared to dream, without apology, in the way a boy once forgotten had grown into a man determined to make sure no other child would have to walk alone. Mateo stood after a while, brushing the dust from his jeans. He placed a hand against the trunk of the painted tree, feeling the coolness of the wall seep into his palm. Then he turned away, heading down the familiar path toward the gate. The mural would be there tomorrow, and the day after. Long after the names had been forgotten, long after faces changed and memories faded, the tree would stand, roots deep, branches wide, a living testament to the idea that even in the harshest soil, hope could grow, and sometimes that was enough. The road leading to the orphanage looked almost the same. The trees had grown taller, their branches arching across the narrow lane like old friends reaching for each other. The stones underfoot were still uneven. The scent of dust and wildflowers filled the warm afternoon air. Keanu walked slowly, a simple canvas bag slung over one shoulder, a worn baseball cap pulled low over his forehead. No entourage, no photographer, no speeches, just a man retracing steps that had once changed the course of 2 lives. When he reached the entrance, he paused for a moment, taking in the sight before him. The courtyard had transformed. The faded paint, the broken swings, the tired walls, all had been tended with love and care. Children darted back and forth across the open space, chasing soccer balls, braiding each other's hair, scribbling chalk drawings onto the pavement. The tree mural stretched tall and proud along the entrance wall, vibrant even after all these years. The roots seemed deeper now, the branches reached higher. It looked like it had always been there, part of the very bones of the place. Keanu stepped quietly through the gate, blending into the background the way he had learned to do so well. He leaned against a sun-warmed stone pillar, keeping to the shade, letting the life of the orphanage unfold in front of him. Then he saw him. Mateo, for now, but unmistakable. The same steady presence, the same quiet strength that Keanu remembered from that dusty courtyard years ago. Mateo knelt by a group of younger children near the mural, showing them how to plant small flowers in handmade pots. His movements were patient, his voice low and encouraging. Every so often he laughed, an easy, unburdened sound that filled the air like music. Keanu watched without moving. He watched as Mateo wiped dirt from a small boy's hands with the corner of his own shirt. Watched as he showed a shy girl how to pat down the soil gently, telling her that strong roots needed time and that it was okay to grow slowly. There were no news cameras circling, no grand announcements being made. Just the quiet hum of goodness passing forward, one moment, one life at a time. Keanu smiled faintly, feeling a warmth rise up in his chest that had nothing to do with the sun overhead. This was why he had come back. Not to be seen, not to be thanked, but to see, to witness the simple miracle of belief taking root in someone else's hands and flourishing far beyond anything he could have orchestrated. Keanu stayed a long time, leaning there in the shade, unnoticed and content. He didn't need to interrupt. The story was already being written, and it was more beautiful than anything he could have ever planned. As the afternoon wore on, Keanu moved along the edges of the courtyard, keeping a respectful distance. He watched Mateo lead the children through simple exercises. They practiced teamwork games, painted clay pots, and listened to short stories under the shade of the big tree. Every few minutes, laughter would rise like a wave, genuine and loud, filling the courtyard with a kind of music that no orchestra could match. Keanu noticed the small details. The way Mateo knelt to meet each child at eye level when they spoke. The way he clapped quietly when a shy boy managed to share his name out loud. The way he paused before answering a question, always giving the kids time to find their own thoughts first. There was no rush here, no performance, only presence, only patience. Keanu drifted toward the garden wall, where some of the younger kids had left small stones painted with bright colors. Names and messages covered the rocks, forming a winding river at the base of the tree mural. He knelt briefly, running his hand lightly over the stones. Most were messages of hope. Keep on. You are loved. Strong hearts, strong roots. Each word felt like a whisper of the spirit that had been nurtured here long after he had first stumbled into Mateo's life. Keanu looked up and watched as a tiny girl with pigtails ran into Mateo's arms, showing him a flower she had picked. Mateo bent low to examine it, as if she had just brought him the most precious treasure in the world. Keanu smiled again, a quiet, proud smile. He remembered a different courtyard, a different boy, a photo clutched too tightly, a heart too bruised to hope for much. Now here was Mateo, carrying forward the gift he had once been given, multiplying it, sharing it, living it, without ever needing anyone to remind him why. Keanu knew it was time to go. He stayed long enough to see Mateo sit with the children for a closing circle, where each of them shared one good thing about their day. Some spoke about planting flowers, some talked about meeting new friends, some just said they felt happy. That was enough. It was more than enough. Keanu turned quietly, retracing his steps back to the lane lined with towering trees. As he walked away, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The tree, with its strong roots, would stand long after he was gone. The children's laughter would echo against the stones long after his footsteps faded. And Mateo's kindness would stretch into the future, unseen but unbreakable, just like the seeds once planted in silence so many years before. Sometimes, Keanu thought, the greatest reward was knowing you had lit a spark that could survive the darkest nights. And here, in this forgotten corner of the world, that spark had grown into a forest of hope, a home made of invisible, indestructible love. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not the ones that are seen, but the ones quietly lived. They are the seeds planted without applause, the hands reaching out in the dark when no one is watching, the moments where a whisper of belief carries someone across an impossible distance. Mateo never learned the name of the person who first believed in him. He never uncovered the full story behind the envelopes that appeared under his pillow, the quiet opportunities placed in his path, and in the end, he realized he didn't need to know. The truth was never in the signature. It was in the legacy left behind. It lived in the way he sat with a frightened child until their breathing steadied, in the way he stayed late to sweep the floors of the bridge long after everyone else had gone home, in the way he believed, stubbornly and completely, that every life mattered, even when the world tried to convince him otherwise. Some might say his story was small. There were no parades held in his honor, no viral videos or televised awards. But to the children who clutched their first pair of new shoes because of him, to the teenagers who dared to dream of college because he had shown them they could, to the countless boys and girls who found their voice inside his quiet circles, Mateo was a giant. Not because he was loud, but because he stayed, because he saw, because he carried forward a belief born from a silent miracle once given to him. And that is where the truest greatness lies, not in what the world sees, but in the lives touched when no one else is looking. Maybe there is someone in your life who believed in you when you were ready to give up. Maybe it was a teacher who stayed after class when everyone else left. Maybe it was a neighbor who smiled when you thought you were invisible. Maybe it was a stranger whose small kindness reached deeper than they would ever know. Their names might fade with time, their faces might blur around the edges of memory, but the way they made you feel, the way they lit a light inside you when the night was darkest, that stays. It becomes part of who you are. It shapes the way you reach out to others, the way you see the world, the way you choose to keep going even when it would be easier to stop. So today, as you carry forward your own story, ask yourself this: who planted the first seed of belief in you? Who whispered that you were more than your fears, more than your past, more than the mistakes you thought defined you? And if you could say one thing to them, what would it be? Has someone's quiet belief in you changed your life? We would love to hear your incredible story below. Your words might just be the seed someone else needs today. And if you believe in the quiet miracles of unseen kindness, if you believe that one simple act can ripple out to change lives beyond your own, make sure you stay with us. Because in our next story, Keanu Reeves stumbles upon a struggling single dad trying to build a future from the ground up. What happens next will melt your heart. See you there.